Hello, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. After 2 days of negotiations, representatives from China and the U.S. have reached a framework consensus. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian stated that China keeps its promises in hopes that the U.S. can work with China to implement the consensus reached by the two heads of state. Lin Jian emphasized that China has always meant what it says and delivers on its words. Since a consensus has been reached, both sides should abide by it. Make use of the China-U.S. Economic and Trade Consultation Mechanism to enhance consensus, reduce misunderstandings, and strengthen cooperation through communication and dialogue. From the spokesperson's response, we can see that the direction of China-U.S. relations still depends on whether the U.S. will fulfill its commitments. If Trump comes up with more measures to contain China, the rare earth golden hook will still be tightened. While China and the U.S. have temporarily called a truce, the EU is still wavering between the two sides. Originally, the golden opportunity was to reach some deeper economic and trade cooperation agreements with China before the U.S. did, which would have given the EU more bargaining chips in negotiations with America. However, the EU still can't let go of its mentality of wanting to side with the U.S., the big boss. With the G7 summit coming up, the EU doesn't really have much to discuss with Trump, so they're bringing up China again. According to foreign media reports, the EU is going to impose sanctions on two small Chinese banks because they facilitated Russia in bypassing the EU's existing trade restrictions. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian responded by saying that China has always opposed unilateral sanctions in long-arm jurisdiction that have no basis in international law and are not authorized by the UN Security Council. At present, most countries, including those in Europe and America, are conducting trade with Russia. Normal exchanges and cooperation between Chinese and Russian enterprises comply with WTO rules and market principles, are not targeted at any third party, and should not be interfered with or affected. The EU is still playing these political games, trying to win over countries from the global south while China and the US are having major disputes. On June 10th, at a meeting in Brazil, EU officials tried to take a swing at China and a kick at the US, pitching the idea to the attending Latin American officials that neither China nor the U.S. can be trusted. At the same time, they called on Latin American countries not to take sides between China and the U.S., but instead to choose to cooperate with the stable and predictable EU. According to foreign media reports, on that day, Brian Lynn, executive director of the European External Action Service, said in a speech at an international security conference in Brazil that the EU does not seek to distance itself from either of the major powers, China or the US, but the current situation has changed. Glynn first mentioned that Trump's return to the White House would bring instability to transatlantic relations, and then went on to smear the relationship between China and Russia. He also mentioned the tense relationship between the EU and the Trump administration, but stated that the EU would continue to cooperate with like-minded partners, including state governments in the U.S. such as California. When talking about China's growing trade influence in Latin America, he hyped up the so-called issue of unfair trade. Glynn told the Latin American officials present that the export-oriented, fossil fuel-driven economic model is now a thing of the past. Our shared agenda between the EU and Latin America is a green, digital, and just transition. He also said that the EU is not here to exploit resources, but to jointly develop a growth agenda for this new economy and to ensure the EU's own transformation. On the same day, Roland Thijs, a member of Germany's CDU, also urged the EU to formulate a more independent foreign policy. Thijs said that we need to be more resilient and reduce our dependence on the two global superpowers. This means we need to double down on cooperation and show the global south that, when others bring uncertainty, Europe can offer predictability and meaningful partnerships. Over the past year, the EU has been stepping up its engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean, making new commitments in financing and political cooperation in an effort to position itself as a long-term, values-based partner. In order to counter China's influence, the EU actually launched its ambitious Global Gateway Infrastructure plan back in 2021. Although the EU avoids directly mentioning China, it is widely believed that this plan is aimed at countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. Some German think tank experts have pointed out bluntly that without the Belt and Road Initiative, there wouldn't be the Global Gateway. the EU has already allocated investments for the Latin American region, including recent agreements in countries like Argentina and Chile on clean hydrogen, digital infrastructure, and sustainable lithium supply chains. EU officials are full of confidence, believing that the EU can provide a trustworthy alternative to the Belt and Road and respond to the growing skepticism towards the US from the global South. At the same time, the EU is also formulating plans to push forward trade negotiations with the Southern Common Market. In addition, another round of the EU and Community of Latin American and Caribbean States Forum is expected to be held this November, where the two economic blocs will engage in cooperation and dialogue. In September 2023, the EU announced the establishment of the Global Gateway Business Advisory Board, made up of a total of 60 companies. However, some media outlets noticed that one company on the board might cause embarrassment for the EU. Among the names announced at the time, the board included Portugal's EDP Group, whose largest single shareholder is currently China's state-owned Three Gorges Corporation, holding about 20% of the shares. At the time, some European media described this as quite an awkward situation for the EU. Let me sum up a few observations. First, the EU still wants to win over countries from the global South, including those in Latin America. However, while their words sound nice, in reality, the cooperation can't be put into practice, and they simply can't offer the policies that Latin American countries are looking for. For example, the free trade agreement negotiations between the EU and Mercosur countries, which include Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, have already dragged on for 25 years. Last year, they finally reached the stage of counting the details, but due to strong opposition from countries like France, the signing has now been postponed indefinitely. So, the EU, represented by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, is a typical example of talking big but being powerless when it comes to action. Secondly, Latin America's main exports are agricultural products: beef, coffee, soybeans, fruit, wine, and iron ore. What they need most are large-scale infrastructure projects and industrial goods with high-cost performance. So, what can the EU actually offer? How much of Latin America's products can they actually buy? In fact, China is the most reliable partner for Latin America. The leaders of Latin American countries naturally understand this. Thirdly, European officials like to boast about their green economy. But if you look around the world, over the past year, the biggest contributor to global clean energy installations has been China, the very country the EU calls unreliable. It's also China that has made photovoltaic power generation affordable and accessible to the general public. It's exactly because of protectionism that the EU is blocking Chinese new energy products from entering Europe, which is slowing down their own carbon reduction progress. No one even knows if they can achieve carbon neutrality on time. The conclusion is, the EU is actually the unstable force here. They just follow the US. When Biden is in office, they go along with Biden to confront Russia. But when Trump stops, the EU is left clueless, constantly changing their foreign policy. Unlike the EU or Germany, China's cooperation with Global South countries is really taking off. With the successful convening of the coordinators' ministerial meeting of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Changsha and the implementation of its outcomes, China-Africa cooperation has reached a new level, sparking a lot of discussion from the outside world. According to the Changsha Declaration on China-Africa Solidarity and Cooperation with the Global South issued at the meeting, China will implement zero-tariff treatment for 100% of taxable products from 53 African countries that have diplomatic relations with China. Reports have noted that only one African country is excluded from these measures, which is Eswatini. Eswatini is currently the only African country that maintains diplomatic ties with Taiwan. At the 2024 Beijing Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, China will announce, on the basis of granting zero-tariff treatment for 100% of taxable products from Africa's least developed countries, the introduction of further measures for these countries. These include deepening market access for goods trade, improving inspection and quarantine procedures, streamlining customs clearance, as well as increasing capacity building and technical training, and promoting high-quality products. Raymond Huyn, CEO of Renaissance International Consulting in Beijing, which focuses on China-Africa cooperation, said that this move by China is not just symbolic, it represents a structural shift in China-Africa trade relations. He believes that trade between Africa and China used to face a bottleneck, as tariff preferences were mainly given to the least developed countries. This, combined with export competition among African countries, created a distortion in China-Africa trade relations. He said that for this reason, simply removing tariffs is not enough. Exporters still face obstacles such as language barriers, logistics, and e-commerce costs. In order to truly diversify trade, not just limit it to raw materials, it is necessary to make it easier for middle-income countries that already have production bases to access the market. Currently, China is Africa's largest trading partner. In 2024, trade between China and Africa was nearly $300 billion, while Africa's trade with the U.S. during the same period was only $71.6 billion. Lawrence Johnston, an expert on China-Africa relations and associate professor at the University of Sydney China Studies Center, said that African countries may face even greater barriers to market entry than inspection and quarantine, such as issues with electricity, infrastructure, human resources, as well as plant quarantine and other technical standards. He believes that for the least developed countries, skills and technical training might be the more important part of this agreement. Related scholarships can also be implemented immediately. Observers have pointed out that China's expansion of zero-tariff treatment for African countries is a strategy adopted in response to the impact of Trump's trade tariff policies, aiming to build China's image as a more reliable trade partner for Africa. Adil Kamen, an international relations researcher based in Nairobi, believes that due to trade and economic conflicts with the United States, China also hopes to expand more markets in the global south. In conclusion, under Trump's leadership, the United States imposed high tariffs, which in effect reduced its participation in the global procurement supply chain and also weakened America's influence. On the other hand, China aims to become the backbone of the global supply chain by presenting itself as a force for stability.